Hello and welcome to The View from Mayer Brown podcast. This is a fortnightly podcast series for employment lawyers and HR practitioners which highlights developments in case law and legislative changes of importance to UK employers. It's presented by Nicholas Robertson, the head of Mayer Brown's London employment team. This podcast is available via iTunes, YouTube and the Twitter feed Nicholas Robertson, Twitter handle @NicholasRobert11. It is also now available on Spotify, Google Play and Yahoo. The time spent listening to these podcasts can count towards your continuing education requirements. And at the end of the podcast, we will explain how to get in touch if you wish to claim credit for continuing education purposes or if you have any comments or questions.
Hello and welcome. After the excitement that was podcast number 180, we're now on to podcast 181. What's the cause for the podcast? Well, sadly, the UK government's now published a whole slew of updated guidance notes in connection with the changes to the furlough scheme, which will start to take effect from the 1st of July. The updates to the guidance notes have been spread liberally throughout the existing guidance notes, and some new guidance notes have been created too, just to add to the mix. I think someone calculated we're now up to our 14th iteration of the main guidance note, and the sheer volume of documentation for employers to look through and to be familiar with is, I think, potentially going to be a bit of an impediment for employers making use of the furlough scheme. Certainly it's going to be easier than ever before to inadvertently get things wrong with potentially adverse consequences on an HMRC audit. Obviously, a lot of people's attention is going to be focused on the detail of the flexible furloughing scheme, but there are a number of other points that are sort of buried in there, which I think are important to look at. Obviously, the fundamental key point is guidance note is just the guidance note. We know there's going to be another Treasury direction. I saw a reference online to someone saying that it was going to be provided on Thursday this week. It makes a bit of a change, and not Friday, but we will see. But obviously, when that comes out, there'll need to be a further review of quite what has changed in the direction, and inevitably, whether the direction was something that matches the guidance notes, or whether it is, there are disparities. We'll see. I'm banking on disparities, by the way, but don't quote me on that. Well, first up, we almost have an answer to the long-running question of whether or not consent is necessary, whether an employee's consent is a necessary precondition to being validly furloughed. The wording in the guidance note has been changed on this point. The previous guidance note, which I think was 29th May, said, quote, "To be eligible for the grant, employees must confirm in writing to their employee confirming that they have been furloughed. If this is done in a way that is consistent with employment law, that consent is valid for the basis of claiming through the scheme. Collective agreement reached between an employer and a trade union is also acceptable for the purpose of such a claim." Unquote. Well, that left open key issues as to whether or not an employee who was furloughed in accordance with a legitimate business instruction could be taken to have agreed to the furlough by virtue of having signed up to the contract position, to contract pursuant to which the instruction was given. If you remember, before that, the direction certainly seemed to envisage that a consent, specific consent was necessary. Well, what we've got now in the relevant guidance note is the following, quote, "To be eligible for the grant, employers must have confirmed to their employee, brackets, or reach collective agreement with the trade union, in writing that they have been furloughed. You must make sure the agreement is consistent with employment equality and discrimination laws, keep a written record of the agreement for 5 years, and keep records of how many hours your employees work and the number of hours they are furloughed." So you can see significant change. This goes further than any of the guidance notes previously in indicating that an employee's agreement to being furloughed is now a thing of the past. Where an employer is making changes to the contract, then a fresh agreement it does appear to be necessary, but where the employer is not, and simply sending someone on furlough cannot by itself be a change to the contract, otherwise it would be entirely circular. So it does mean there's a slight anomaly, because one of the things the employer is directed to do is to keep a written record of the agreement for 5 years. But I think what they're really getting at there is, if there is an agreement, you have to keep it for 5 years. Otherwise, it would be sufficient to keep a written instruction, the letter instructing the employee to go on furlough. You need to keep the letter for 5 years. I certainly don't think the reference later on in the relevant clause to keeping the agreement somehow means we're back to having to have an agreement in the first place. The other thing to note about this is, though, that we get clarity on consent where people are being furloughed. Great. But that's different when you're dealing with flexible furloughing. So obligations on employers who are looking to furlough employee flexibly are set out in the next paragraph of the guidance note. And this is what it says. If you flexibly furlough employees, you will need to agree this with the employee or reach collective agreement with the trade union and keep a new written agreement that confirms the new furlough arrangement, unquote. So, looking at that does seem to be, first of all, drawing a clear distinction between the original requirements where someone is being furloughed and the requirements for when individuals are coming back on a flexible basis. And, I think the obvious point to make is there's absolutely zero logic for that distinction. Why is express agreement needed to have an employee partly suspended under the contract, but there's no need to have a written agreement with the employee if they are being, in effect, fully suspended from work? However, the guidance note on this point is clear. You need to have agreement, and it looks like it's a new agreement, and you need to keep a copy of that new agreement. Obviously, this does leave open quite what amounts to agreement for these purposes. Clearly, it would be sufficient if the employee countersigns a letter or a similar written acceptance, via email, for example. But is the employee agreeing the flexible arrangement simply by turning up for work at the preordained time and then accepting pay for that period, for the period worked, based on the fact that they are working? Since there's a reasonable amount of time before flexible furloughing can begin, 1st of July, my suggestion would be that employers sidestep all of this by seeking to have a written agreement with each employee or a written document which can be accepted either before or, say, on the employee's first day back at work if it's otherwise proved difficult to get a signature. The advantage is that by seeking a written agreement, the employer can be very clear about the extent of the employer's instructions to attend work and know that the employee has, in countersigning that, effectively accepted it. I think I'd mentioned in a previous podcast that it's going to be necessary for employers to review all their existing furlough documentation. And one of the advantages if you take this route is it is going to be possible to be much clearer about the hours you're expecting people to work and what you're not expecting them to work. The other question, of course, that's raised by this approach is what happens if the employee refuses to consent to being flexibly furloughed? The government's insistence that there needs to be an agreement with the employee seems to give the employee a choice as to whether or not to accept flexible furloughing. Many employees may be concerned about a return to work. If employers are looking to ease employees back gently into the working environment by making use of flexible furloughing, the right to consent or not to flexible furloughing hands a significant chunk of the decision-making power back to the employee themselves. This seems to be slightly odd because it means the employer can furlough without agreement, can unfurlough without agreement, but to have flexible furloughing needing agreement. The other point I wanted to make, really by way of sort of context for this, is the guidance notes have changed the ground rules helpfully in terms of the trigger for being able to claim under the furlough scheme. The main document, Check If You Can Claim for Employees' Wages Through the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, sets out the basic test for being able to claim. Previous guidance note was said, and I think had said through more than one iteration, quote, if you cannot maintain your workforce because your operations have been severely affected by coronavirus, you can furlough employees and apply for a grant, unquote. This has now been amended to say, if you cannot maintain your workforce because your operations have been affected by coronavirus, you can furlough employees and apply for a grant. So in other words, it's no longer necessary for your operations to have been severely affected. This presumably must make it easier for employers to claim. We've seen a number of cases where employers have, like Liverpool Football Club, for example, tried to furlough some employees and then backed off in the face of public storm. Certainly, if employers have furloughed employees and then find adverse publicity coming their way because they shouldn't be using the scheme for those purposes, well, if your business has been affected by the coronavirus, how many people are going to have businesses that haven't been affected by the coronavirus in one way or another? I'd have thought none whatsoever in the UK. Unless you have got a mythical business that consists of working from home full time and is in no way affected by disruption in supplies or disruption with customers. Well, there might be a business like that, but clearly it seems to be drafted in the way that any business now effectively can legitimately say, in the light of this guidance note, here we are, this is the test. What about timescales and time limits, given that this is the transitional scheme that we're now talking about? As I mentioned in the previous podcast, furlough schemes being adapted from 1 July, and there are a number of time limits and timescales that now need to be introduced as part of that transition period process leading to its eventual winding up at the end of October. As we know, no new employees can validly be furloughed after the 10th of June because the furlough scheme is only available for employees who have previously been validly furloughed. There is one of the guidance notes talks about the employer has to have successfully made a claim under the furlough scheme for an employee prior to 30th June in order for them to be furloughed after that. But other guidance notes don't repeat precisely the same formulation. And so I don't think that's a trap. I think that's just clunky drafting. Because, of course, if people were furloughed for the first time at the start of June, entirely validly, a claim may not have gone in before the end of June for them, let alone it being a successful claim. Because, as we know, it takes 6 working days to process the grant money. So, in the circumstances, I just think it means validly furloughed rather than a successful claim. The other thing, so we know that about no new employees. And the other thing we knew was that employers were going to be capped at the maximum number of employees they had previously furloughed. Although there was very little guidance on quite how that was going to work and what the test date for that was. Well, first of all, let's deal with an exception. We've got an exception to the rule about no new employees and also to the cap. Employees who are returning from maternity, shared parental leave, adoption leave, paternity or parental bereavement leave after the 10th of June can validly be furloughed for the first time, provided the employee started the period of leave prior to 10th June and provided they returned after 10th June. The employer in question must also have previously submitted a claim for other furloughed employees by the 30th of June. It isn't going to be their first furlough claim. Point to note, I don't think it requires the people to come off the period of leave and go straight on to furlough. I just think they have to have returned after the 10th of June and then been furloughed subsequently. Secondly, when calculating the cap for the maximum number of people that can be furloughed at any one time by the employer after the 1st of July, no account needs to be taken of individuals who are being furloughed for the first time by view of this statutory exception for maternity returners, etc. Secondly, we've now got further details about how the cap on future numbers is to operate. After 1 July, the employer cannot claim for a number of furloughed employees that exceeds the number of employees validly furloughed in a claim period prior to 30 June. The guidance note gives an example. It probably makes it a bit clearer. It says you've got 3 months. An employer's furloughed people over March, April and May, and he's furloughed 30 employees, 20 employees and 50 employees. So there were 50 employees furloughed in May. That's the cap. The cap is the most number of people furloughed during any claim period for that particular employer. Employers are going to have to look carefully where they're proposing to make ongoing use of the furlough scheme after 1 July to ensure that they've got this cap in mind. You would assume that many employers would be looking to reduce the number of furloughed employees in the latter stages, but that doesn't necessarily follow. For example, a business that has been ticking along, making some use of the furlough scheme, might be looking at its operations and deciding that reluctantly, after all, it's going to close part of its operations down and wants to put those employees on furlough. Well, the cap, if nothing else, might well get in the way of doing that. Another change, under the furlough scheme, as is well known, employees must be furloughed for a minimum of a 3-week period in order for the claim to be valid. After 1 July, this requirement is going to drop away, but there is a trap. If the employee is furloughed before 30th June, then that furlough period must last for a minimum of 3 weeks, even if it completes after 1 July. The ability to furlough employees for a shorter period only applies to new furlough arrangements which are put in place after 1 July. Claims for furloughed employees from 1 July onwards must be made on a calendar month basis. They mustn't cross into a new month. It's no longer going to be permissible to have a furlough claim that covers a longer period. Employers may only make one claim for a furlough grant per pay period, so it's obviously important that the employer gets it right when submitting the claim. This may particularly be an issue with employees who are flexibly furloughed. The guidance note says that employers should claim when they have certainty about the number of hours their employees are working. Interestingly, the guidance note contemplates that an employee might be brought back on a flexible basis, but in practice work more hours than contemplated in the agreement, necessitating an alteration to the grant being claimed. So, although the employee's agreement is needed to come back on a flexible basis, which is to be recorded in writing, it looks as though the parties might in practice vary that, and that would then have to be reflected in the grant application, as I say. Clearly, if the employer and employee agree a different working pattern from that was recorded in writing before they came back, then parties would be well advised to have a document somewhere that records this revision against any future HMRC audit. And the guidance note indicates that claims for grants can be made 14 days before the claim period ends, and claims are usually paid out within 6 working days after the claim has been made. The guidance note quotes steps to take before calculating a claim under the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, provides significant further detail about the flexible furloughing scheme. This is then backed up by worked examples which have been issued as part of the guidance. The most straightforward example is for an employee who is paid monthly and is contracted to work a set number of hours per week. However, even here, and I warn you, it's going to get messy, even here, the worked example covers 2 pages full of explanation, and it requires 11 basic steps, calculations, computations, together with 8 further steps in connection with calculating the national insurance rebate, and 8 further steps for calculating the pension contributions payments recovery, which of course only apply during July. So that's the most straightforward example. But the key point is, the government has opted, surprise, surprise, for the less generous approach to flexible furloughing, probably most easily illustrated by talking about an employee. Let's imagine an employee who's paid bang on the maximum that is recoverable under the furlough scheme. So their pay is £2,500 per month net, £3,125 per month gross. Let's imagine they're furloughed, no pay cuts or anything. Employer can only claim back 80% of the furloughed, of the normal wages. So the employer is already paying 20% of the employee's wages. So under the flexible furloughing, can the employee be brought back 1 day a week? And the employer says, well, I'm already paying 20%, 1 day a week's worth of cost, so therefore I can still claim £2,500 a month in furlough grant. No, that's not the way it's going to work. Basically, an employer who asks an employee to work 20% of their time and furloughs them for 80% of the time, they will receive a commensurately lower furlough grant, effectively down 20%, because they're working 20% of their time. Just breaking that down in slightly more detail, the employer needs to start off by working out the usual hours worked by the employee. This is basic contracted hours. So in practice, if the employee tends to work more than their basic hours, this is irrelevant unless it can be said there's been some sort of contractual amendment such that the employer and employee have agreed to a higher number of basic hours. Secondly, having done that, it's necessary to identify the working pattern. So if an individual works 40 hours per week, then it's a weekly working pattern. The employer then works out the daily rate by dividing the number of hours, and this is in my hypothetical example 40 hours, by the number of calendar days, not working days, the number of calendar days in the working pattern. If it's a weekly working pattern, 7. This then gives a daily number of usual hours, which is then multiplied by the total number of calendar days in the pay period in question. Fine. And in calculating that, employers are to ignore periods of annual leave, sick leave, family-related statutory leave, and just run the calculations on the assumption that the employee was working throughout that period. For employees with variable hours, where pay varies by the amount of time worked, the calculation to establish usual hours is a little more complicated. It can be based on the average number of hours worked in the tax year 2019-20, or by looking at the precise corresponding calendar period in the year 2019-20. This has to be repeated each month for the corresponding calendar period. For such employees, it's only permissible to include overtime if the pay for those hours was not discretionary, which is about as ambiguous a sentence as I think you could have. Where employees work overtime, they become entitled to pay pursuant to the contract. Is that sufficient? Or does the employee have to have both a contractual right to work overtime and a contractual right to be paid for the overtime actually worked? I suspect it's the latter, not the former, but, we will see. Well, anyway, having worked out the usual hours, the next step is to calculate the furloughed hours during the period for which the claim is being made. So this can be done by calculating the total number of usual hours, then subtracting the hours actually worked, and then you claim that percentage of £2,500. So an employer who gets an employee to work precisely half of their usual working hours will be able to claim £1,250 under this revised arrangements. So, where does this leave us all? Well, there's undoubtedly a lot of benefit to employers from being able to reintroduce individuals back into the working environment on a flexible basis. So to that extent, it's obviously helpful the government has thought to make this as user-friendly as possible. The employer and employee can agree whatever pattern they see fit, but I think the complexity of running calculations to work out a claim in respect of a flexibly furloughed employee is going to deter many employers. Equally, an employer is looking to organise a flexible return to work scheme is going to be unimpressed to find that employees can, apparently validly, refuse their consent to a partial return to work. This may make it more difficult for the employer to organise a structured return to work, especially if those returning are concerned about health and safety issues, and they can see other employees refusing to return. In truth, I think this is probably a wider issue than just flexible furloughing. I think employers need to think very carefully about how the return to work is going to operate, what measures should be put in place to demonstrate safety if there's returning to work in the workplace, and equally, and this is the most difficult thing of all, managing that difficult balancing act between being fair to all and making appropriate exceptions where circumstances justify. So, that is the latest iteration of the flexible of the guidance notes, and it sounds as if I'll be doing another podcast towards the end of the week on the Treasury direction when that comes out. In the meantime, of course, I hope everyone stays safe. Very proud to say that my Brewdog turned up with my order of Barnard Castle eye test. Can't say I've tried any of it yet, but yes, I'll let you know how that goes down on the next podcast. Anyway, in the meantime, take care, everyone, and here's to the next podcast. Cheers.
So that concludes this podcast. We hope that you find it and others in the series helpful. If you have any comments or questions or want to know how to claim continuing education credits, please email Nick at nrobertson@mayorbrown.com. Thank you for listening to the podcast.